Alrighty. So before we sort of really dive in, a little bit of a description for you guys of my life last year. So you guys know last year, toward the end of the summer, mid to end of summer, I got married and moved out from my parents' house into a new house, and we got a puppy. And so all of these changes happened in my life, and it was great, right? Except for the first 4 months, maybe 5, I still had all of the commitments that I had made as a single person, right? So I'm like, oh, I signed up to do all of these college classes and all this sub work and all this stuff at the rock gym and all this Bible study stuff and all this other Bible study stuff and all this other stuff that's going on. And I was like, okay, that's fine. I can do that on top of being married and having a puppy and taking care of the house and doing meals. And I was like, no, I can't. No, you cannot do that. That is not possible to do. And so I was in a new season of life and trying to live as if I was in a different season of life. Now, I wasn't really trying, because I recognized very quickly, I'm like, oh, this is bad. This is not a healthy way to live my existence. I need to do something different. And so this semester we're doing things a little bit differently, trying to figure things out. But today we're in the first part of chapter 3, and we're looking at seasons. And we're going to see how Kohelet recommends that we handle all of the different seasons that God allows and places into our lives. Now, before we start hiking through chapter 3, let's do a little bit of a recap of where we've traveled so far. So remember, we did our book introduction, and then we went through this whole thing, chapters 1 and 2. We introduced this idea of Yitron, gain, and Kohelet is asking the question, how do we gain? What is the lasting gain that we get from all of these things that we spend our time on in life? And we went through the gambit. We looked at toil, wisdom, and pleasure, and then we re-examined them, and we sort of came to the conclusion that, okay, you know what? At the end of the day, these are not good things to have as goals in and of themselves. They're unworthy, they're insubstantial, they sort of flitter away like that morning breath where you sort of breathe out and then just poofs away in the wind. Now, of course, today there were no such breaths because it was just rain, and so anything that came out of your mouth immediately just sort of went down, but you get the idea. However, Kohelet also, remember, we had our first enjoy life refrain. So Kohelet says that God has given these things to us as good gifts. And we're going to see that reinforced today. And so we ought to enjoy them and thank him for it. And so that's what we're looking at as we're moving into this section. So before we dive into the meat of chapter 3, take just 1 to 2 minutes, turn to the person who's close to you, and talk about what stood out from the chapter 2 lesson from last week. And if you weren't here, you can just skip that one and move straight to number 2. So this section showed how expending effort, whether in pursuing pleasure, wielding wisdom, or undertaking toil, can end up empty and unsatisfactory, both short and long term. And which of these areas do you most identify with? Go. So as we move into this next section, we're going to see that Kohelet still seems to be considering the question of what permanent gain do people achieve from all of the toil. And so keep that in mind as we're rolling into this next section. So we're going to open up chapter 3. We're going to read verse 1. For everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven. So let's start off by talking about the words season and time. So effectively, these words are being used as synonyms, but they can be used slightly differently. So we are going to take just a brief look. So the word season means a defined, appointed, or certain time. So you can say, okay, point to it that we are setting an appointment for this time right here. And then the word that's translated as time means a duration of time or a segment of time. Now, to illustrate the slight difference, let me present an illustration from the rock climbing world, because of course. So at the end of our more advanced levels of rock climbing classes, when the kids have finished working on these hard climbs, sometimes we make them do a rock climbing workout. So they may have to do a certain number of climbs, or do climb up and then climb back down, then climb back up and then climb back down, or do the same climb like 4 times in a row. There's lots of options, and it's so much fun to torture the children. I mean, I mean, it's really good to get them working on their endurance and power. Anyway, so after I've explained the workout, I'll tell them scurry around and pick their climbs. And then I say, it's time, go. So in that case, it's the appointed time that the time to begin has arrived. The workout has begun. And then after they've climbed themselves silly, I will call time. They've completed their workout segment and they can cool down and go home. And so again, they're very similar words, but they are used slightly differently as you go throughout Scripture. And so as we're looking at the thesis, sort of the main idea for this section, it's important for us to take a pause here before we just dive straight into the list. And in order to get to this spot, we'll need to think about the context of Ecclesiastes and sort of glance forward just a little bit to the concluding verses of this section. What exactly is Kohelet trying to do here? So he's launching in and saying there is an appointed time for every matter under heaven. And we are going to look at the items that he lists, but thinking about the word appointed. So again, take another analogy. Whenever I think about running a race, you'd have to submit your times from a previous race so that they can see how fast are you really, because you can tell them, oh yeah, I run a mile in 8 minutes, and then they're like, no you don't, I don't believe you. So you had to prove it, and then they put you in a starting wave, because they don't let everybody start at once. They put you in a certain wave and release you at certain times. And so they appoint your starting time for the race. And so in this case, the race coordinators are the appointers of the time. And in this case, the person who is appointing our times is obviously God. Yeah, so God is the one who is appointing the times. So we start to question what exactly is going on here. What he is not saying is dance, monkey dance. So he's not saying that we're just sort of puppets on the string. God is saying, okay, I have appointed this in your life and I appointed this in your life, and you're just sort of going through the motions. You don't have free will, and there's really no point to reading this passage because you were appointed to read it anyway. That's not what's going on here. On the other hand, we are not masters of our own destiny. So it's not like we're these masters going throughout the universe and seeking to identify, okay, well, this is the time. I'm seizing my moment here and sort of making it the right time. Instead, we're sort of splitting the baby here. No, that's a bad analogy. It's like, that's wrong. Like bowling. So it's like bowling. We're sort of going straight down the middle. Not splitting. We're cutting it right in half and thinking, okay, so we are, God is sovereign over all, and he has appointed certain things in our lives. That's true. But we still have free choice. We have the ability to either lean into those times and to make the best out of those times that he has given to us, or we can lean away and say, no, I am unhappy with what God has placed in my life right now. I'm not going to recognize what's going on in life right now, and I'm going to make life a lot harder by going through this. Interestingly, so I just taught through Ephesians 1:3 through 14 in our Tuesday night study, and in this context, he's talking about all that God has done for those who are part of his church. And the context of that passage is salvation, and it's intended to be extremely encouraging to the Ephesian believers. Now, the context for Ecclesiastes is he's not aiming to talk about salvation, but the whole of life. And it's not just our individual lives, but all of our lives woven together. But we are sort of looking at and emphasizing what God has done and what God is doing. And you're going to see that especially emphasized in the second half of this section, that the emphasis is on God's action and how we're responding to what God is doing, to lean into that. And so as we go through, remember sort of our threefold goal that Kohelet is trying to get us as the audience to see. He's helping us recognize the heaviness of life, helping us reject those bad paths, and helping us learn how the wise person navigates life in face of these things. And so, as we look into it, there is an appropriate and a fitting moment for each kind of human activity. And some of those, you're going to see, okay, this is the right time. And some of these things, God is just working them into his big plan, and that fittingness of it is not determined by us, but it's determined by God. But we do have that freedom to be able to lean into those times and navigate them well, or to kick and scream, and to sort of make a mess of things. And so let's go ahead and dive in. As we look at this list, we're going to see that it's a list of 7 merisms, and we've used this term merism before. Remember, it's a set of extremes. So on the one hand, this thing over here, on the other hand, this thing over here. And whenever it's used like that, it's meant to indicate totality. So from this extreme to this extreme and everything in between. And there are 7, which is the number of it's the number of completion or perfection. And so as we go through it, it's a really nice poem as we look at it. And so we're gonna look at the poem right here. Let's go. A time to be born and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted. A time to kill and a time to heal. A time to break down and a time to build up. Now, all 4 of these first couplets have to do with endings and beginnings. If you just sort of think about it right off the top of your head, birth and death are the 2 things that we would sort of indicate, okay, yeah, God is obviously the one who controls it. But again, in our lives today, we see that there are a lot of human attempts to sort of usurp God's control. So I have some specific scenarios that I'll throw up there. We have in vitro fertilization. We could debate the ethics of when such a situation might be okay, or you're like, no, never, but we could debate that. But it is definitely, we're sort of stepping into the scenario and saying, okay, we're going to take some control of this. We have surrogacy, where you have somebody donating eggs, somebody donating sperm, and implanting a fetus inside the womb of some woman, and whenever she gives birth to the baby, it goes off to somebody else and she never sees that baby again. And of course, abortion, where you say, okay, you know what, we're actually not going to allow this birth to carry full term, we're going to intervene here. And all of these things are, is God should be the one who's in control, but we're sort of stepping into it and intervening. Now, on the flip end of the spectrum, we have death. It's sort of entertaining to look at culture these days because, I try not to, but I hear things on my podcast and then I'm tempted to go and look them up online, and you shouldn't. You just shouldn't. You shouldn't look these things up online. But we have people like Madonna and Dolly Parton who are up on stage, and it's kind of weird because you're like, I think they're older, aren't they? But they kind of don't look old, but they also kind of do. And you're like, I don't know what's going on. And they've had all these surgeries, they've had all these interventions, and they're trying desperately to avoid looking like they've aged because they're afraid of death and they're afraid of aging. And we have this thing where they're like, I am not going to give in to the fact that God's the one who's in control of death. And on sort of, again, the other end of that spectrum there, we have this death with dignity phrase that's thrown about by people who advocate for physician-assisted suicide. It's legal around the world, and it's even getting to the point where you don't have to be sick. In Canada, they're about to legalize in March. Say, if you just feel sad and you get diagnosed with depression, go ahead. You can go to your doctor, and they'll go ahead and they'll just end your life right there. And we see that in all of these scenarios. Again, it's easy for us to see, okay, humans are striving for control of something that usurps God at his rightful place as Lord of all. Now, I don't know how much of these things Kohelet was seeing in his day and age, but as he expressed, there isn't anything new under the sun. And so, as we look at all of these situations, our goal should be to lean into God's providential ruling, neither hastening nor attempting to arbitrarily intervene with extreme measures in these areas. But at the end of the day, these things are essentially out of our hands. If you think about, if people are trying to have a child, well, you can try for a child, but conception is ultimately in the hands of the Lord. You can think about things like infertility and miscarriages, where I know many women in this room who have really struggled in these areas, and it's not something that You're like, okay, well, this is just what the Lord brought into our lives. On the other hand, you have times where maybe you weren't necessarily trying for a child, and God was like, hello! Surprise! Mariah is here. And so, it's just sort of one of those things. You're like, okay, the Lord is the one who is ultimately in control of conception. And on the other end, again, of the spectrum, of course, we know that sort of as we go throughout life, we have accidents. There's disease, and then there's age, and these things are what God oftentimes uses in our lives to bring about the end. Now, the idea of planting and plucking up have to do with farming. And I don't know about you guys, but most of us, I don't think, are farmers. We're not farmers. However, this parallels and extends the ideas of birth and death. And so as we apply these things to our lives, we can think about, again, changing seasons. People who are either coming to the end of one thing, beginning a new thing, or you can think about, again, the sort of birth and death, beginnings and endings. As we think about sort of the application and leaning into these times, I was reflecting on Gordon Renninger, and we were able to visit him just a couple of days before he died, and they had decided, because of the severity of his condition and sort of the prognosis, they were like, we're going to forego treatment, and we're just gonna wait, and if the Lord decides to miraculously intervene, then okay, but if not, he said, I'm ready. And I remember, so I walked in, and he looked up, and I was like, oh no, he doesn't look good. Somebody else in the room was like, you look good, and he gave the dirtiest look I've ever seen. He was like, I don't look good. But throughout that visit, he and Michelle just exuded peace. There was such joy and hope in the room, and people were coming in and they were reminiscing, and it was just the most graceful passing, the most graceful transition that I've been able to see. And it was a blessing to me to be able to experience that. And I think that's a great example of being able to lean into, okay, this was his time to die. And he did it so well. He just did it so well. And so whether we're at the beginning or at the end, recognizing where we are makes a difference in how we respond. Now let's look at these next couple of verses here. Again, like time to kill, time to heal, time to break down, and time to build up. And these two couplets are really paired together. Because kill and break down are parallel, you can take it either literally, or you can metaphoricalize, that's not a word, I made it up. You can take it slightly figuratively as well. And so if you're thinking about killing, what do you guys think? What's a time where you might feel like, okay, this is appropriate, I'm gonna recognize this time to kill? You're all thinking it is okay, you don't want to say it out loud. Self-defense, okay, thank you. Okay, thank you. Everybody in the room is so willing to say that out loud. We are all thinking it. You're all thinking it. So yeah, so self-defense is a good one, but I think, again, we have the liberty to extend it here. So in our lives, when might be a good time to kill something? Maybe a bad habit. Maybe if you are in a negative communication pattern, maybe that's a good thing to kill. A time waster. Maybe we need to break that down, get rid of it. Lots of things that you could break down and get rid of. Same thing on the other side. So there may be a time in your life where you're called to help somebody else heal, or maybe you're in the active process of physical recovery. But I think you can also think about in your own life and heart that there may be a whole range of things that, there may be things that need to be healed relationally, spiritually, emotionally, all this stuff. And regardless of what kind of healing or building is occurring, it's difficult, I found, in a very personal way, it's difficult to move forward if you're holding tightly to something that's in the past. There's this girl that I know who has experienced pain and difficulty and frustration, and it's left her steeped in bitterness and unable to move forward to new opportunities because she hasn't left that pain of the past behind. God's trying to help her get to a place of healing, but she's holding to the pain of the past. And she needs to recognize that it's okay. It's okay for her to leave that past behind and take those positive steps toward healing. And that can be something that we can definitely struggle with as well. Moving forward, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance. Obviously, mourning and weepings, think about things like a funeral, and then dancing, laughing, we think about things like weddings. And again, these are sort of polarized opposites meant to indicate, okay, not just these extremes, but everything in between. But as we're thinking about, again, mourning, funerals, this quote by Andrew Clavin is engraved in my heart. Grief is a desert that can only be crossed on foot. And I think that it is difficult for us in our American culture to do grief well. I think we can either feel like we have to rush through it and pretend like we're fine and be like, no, everything's fine. Don't look at me. Don't look at me too long. If you look at me too long, I'm gonna cry, but I'm not allowed to cry. Or we can sort of cross to that other extreme and say, again, that we're holding on for so long and we're not willing to let go of the grief of the past. And grieving is, whenever God allows those times of grieving to enter our lives, it's something that we can do well, or we cannot. On the other side of the spectrum, again, enjoy the moment. So I had a conversation with Sarah Jones just the other day about how quickly her kids were growing up. And she just happened to say, I tell you, you've really got to enjoy each moment because the time goes so fast. Again, thinking back to my wedding day, let me tell you, that wasn't time intended for laughing and dancing, right? And I'm sure that, as I think back, that there are things that I could have decided to be upset about or gotten all bridezilla and be like, ah, and angry, but leaning into the joy of the day, that's right? That's what's intended for God whenever we have those times that God has bestowed in our lives, for us to lean into those times. And sometimes, again, that's easier to see for somebody else's life than it is whenever we're reflecting in our own lives. But again, leaning into those times helps to make it more meaningful. All right, let's look at the next verses. A time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together. A time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. There is a lot of debate about what these first set of couplets means, a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together. Some people say that it's like, it's when you throw stones into somebody's yard and then whenever you clear the stones from your yard. And then, looking through the range of the possible things, I was like, honestly, especially whenever you compare it with the time to embrace and time to refrain from embracing, I'm like, this makes zero sense. I have no idea what's going on. However, there is a potential interpretation that I've decided to land on this one. You can disagree with me, but I think that it works well paired again with that second couplet and potentially sexual relations. And so if you think about the phrase, if you scatter your seed, it's very similar. It's one of the oldest rabbinical interpretations of this passage as well. And again, it pairs with embracing and refraining from embracing. So that's what makes sense to me. And so these center on relational development. And you can definitely take this direction of there are times to show your love and times when PDA is not appropriate. So you can go that direction, right? And scripture lays out clear boundaries for sex, and we've probably all been in situations or been guilty of situations where, a couple was not aware of their surroundings and everybody else in the room's like, oh my gosh, please leave. Oh my word. But I want to broaden the idea out further. Again, thinking about the idea of developing relationships. And of course, I didn't put that up on the screen. It's fine. Relational development. Developing relationships, regardless of what category we're looking at, is especially important, I think, to us as women. I was in a group of women the other day, and I shared, I just got married at the ripe old age of 30. And two other women immediately spoke up, and one was like, well, I didn't get married until I was in my late 30s, and went on. And the other one was saying, well, I'm still dating, and I'm over 40. And two of us had gotten to the point where we were like, okay, we recognize God's hand in delaying that relationship until we found the right person. But it kind of sucked while we were waiting. We were really good. I was recognizing that I was still in this period of non-marriageness, but it was not fun. I did not enjoy it. And the other lady was like, yeah, I'm not married yet, and this is actually kind of frustrating. And it was difficult. She's like, I feel the struggle of I want to be. I'm not in this next season yet, but I want to be. And I'm sure we've all been in friendships that have fallen apart. We've all also probably thought, oh my gosh, I would so love to befriend or I would so love to date, this person over here, and for whatever reason, just never took off. And, you've probably also like paired people up in your head and like, oh, they make a great couple, but for whatever reason, the time just wasn't right. And so sometimes we recognize that we want to be in this time of embracing, but it's not. We're in the time of refraining for whatever that looks like in our lives. And I feel like I'm being really negative, and I want to say that obviously there's the other side of the coin, right? That there is the time. There is the time that God gives us where you're like, this is the moment. I tell you, if I spend the time to tell you how I met my husband Josh, you'd be like, wow, that's a really crazy story. I'm like, I know, God's hand's written all over it. If I took the time to tell you about how I met my final roommate for LBC, you would be like, that's really wild. I don't even know how. I'm like, I don't know. I know. It's clearly God's hand. God's hand is in it. And so, we can obviously, again, lean into those times, and we can make life harder for ourselves. So if I am off in a corner alone and I never talk to anybody ever, and whenever somebody comes over, I glare at them and I say, why didn't you come over and talk to me 3 weeks ago? The chances that I'm going to be able to develop relationships with anybody is going to be slim, and it's going to take a very special person to be able to persevere and push through that and be like, no, I want to show you the love of Jesus today. But we can, again, lean into those opportunities, lean into the times that God has given us to help to develop those relationships. Pressing forward. Oh, the thing didn't work correctly. Ignore the fact that both verses are appearing on the screen. It's fine. Verse 6, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to cast away. Honestly, it's hard for me to address this topic with a straight face because as a busy, chaotic, and distracted person, I am constantly losing things. I am always in the season of loss. I'm like, where's my fill in the blank? And I just don't know. Like, my brain can't track anything. And a recent additional twist in the game of life has made this even worse. So my husband, Josh, is very kind and very helpful, and he has mild OCD, and he likes to put things away. The problem is that his idea of away does not match up what my idea of away is, and whenever it goes away, I don't know that he put it away, and so then I'm like, because I already think I've lost it, I am now looking everywhere, and of course never in the place where he put it away, and I'm like, where's it died? Like, it got eaten by a gremlin. Where's the stuff in my life? So, sometimes I just give up, and I'm like, you know what? The time for seeking and searching is not today, and I'm just going to, we're going to abandon this. I've decided I do not need this today. And then there are times where I'm like, it's the dog's collar. The dog needs to go outside. I need to find the dog's collar. We are going to find it. Or, the phone, the keys, the usual stuff. So, but I think that you can really apply this in a broader area of things than just, losing things and keeping and casting away. Think about all of the stuff that we have, all of our possessions, our resources like our house, the things that we put in our house, all of our financial investments. Sometimes we need to seek for something new. Sometimes maybe the Lord, I don't know, the simplicity movement, my heart wants to be there. I'm like, I want to get rid of stuff in my house. But it's hard, right? And our hearts are really deeply invested in these things, and it's very difficult for us to really honestly take a look at our lives and to say, maybe the Lord is calling us to cast away, to lose something. And, and again, because we're thinking about these are not just, I'm going around as the wise person saying, okay, what does the Lord want me to throw away? What does he want me to throw away? But it's also recognizing the times, right? So this is a time of loss. This is a time of keeping that God has bestowed upon us, and that we're leaning into those times, that we're really engaging with the challenge of those times. And so we're holding both in our minds, that it's both, okay, I'm trying to figure out how to navigate this wisely, and recognizing the times that God has put into our lives. And again, this can be difficult because we're kind of protective of these areas. Next verse is already on the screen because my transitions didn't work, probably because, it's my fault. It's actually just not my fault. Sorry. Verse 7, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak. Obviously, it's only time to sew if you can sew. So I've got like the very basic, like I can do a hand stitch. So I can do that. Don't ask me to use a sewing machine. That's all the time for sewing that I have. So obviously, it's not necessarily meant to be like super, super little, but there are times where you're maybe tearing your clothing because, remember, biblical context, when would you tear your clothing? Mourning, yeah, whenever you're expressing mourning, grief, anger, or maybe you just have something that's really old and it's worthless and you're like, we're going to rip this up and we're gonna cast it away, right? But then there are things that you're like, oh, it's worth keeping this. I don't need to get a new one. I can repair this thing. That's an attitude that is not very popular in these days. You're just like, nope, just get a new one. And there's also a time to speak and a time to keep silence. I just flipped them. I was reminded of James chapter 3, verses 1 through 12, which just describes the tongue and the difficulty that it is to keep a handle on your tongue. And I tell you, there are times where I have really messed up. Like being like, this was supposed to be a time where silence was appropriate. And I just blabbed all over a situation, and it impacted the person that I was with. Or there was a time where God laid out an opportunity for me to speak, and out of fear or out of embarrassment, I was just like, we're just not going to say anything. But there have also been times whenever I've been with somebody and they were experiencing grief, and I was able to sit with them, and I was like, I don't have anything to say. But that was the right thing. It was the right thing to just be there in silence. And on the others, again, as I stand here talking, sometimes there are times that God has said, this is your time to speak. And I have difficult with an asterisk to master because I don't know if it's possible. Like there are some people who are like, oh, you're really good at this, but this is a difficult thing to master, to be able to use our words wisely, to be able to recognize this is an appropriate time for me to lean into either using my words or not. Verse 8, time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. Now, war and peace are obviously done at a national level, so it's not like I'm going to wage war on Afghanistan. Like I can't do that. And so again, we sort of recognize that Kohelet is again indicating that these are times that God places in our lives, and we're sort of recognizing those times here. But we do use that language on a day-to-day basis, like we're going to, it's the war on drugs or the war on depression or whatever. And so we do use this language, but on the other hand, we have things like, hold on, why is that there? Okay. Love and hate. And what I want to pause here and really lean into is that we're not the puppets on the string. It's not like, oh, well, I'm full of bitter envy because my best friend has the dude, the kids, the house, the whatever, and I don't. And so, well, I suppose that God has decreed that it's the time to hate. I can't help it. I'm in the period of hate in my life. Oh, well. No. That's a decision. That is a conscious decision that we lean into. So on the one hand, we're recognizing God's role in sovereignly weaving threads together. He is allowing things into our lives. But on the other hand, we recognize that we have real choices. We have real ability to say, yes, this is the thing that I'm going to choose to do. Our flesh may scream time to hate. But God would actually be calling us to love. And to flip the tables on the hypothetical, our American culture today tells us that it's loving to advocate for all that transgender stuff, especially for our young children. To say, oh, well, if you feel uncomfortable with your body, chop off all your privates, take these hormones, and we're going to just make you insane, and we're going to push you towards suicide. And I would say that that's not loving, that's the opposite. And that sort of philosophy is something that I would say, I think it's okay to hate that philosophy and to say, no, that is evil, and I'm going to oppose that. And so, as we slide toward the conclusion in hit 5, lean into the challenge. There we go. Okay. Verse 9. What gain has the worker from his toil? I have seen the business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. He has made everything beautiful in its time. And we see these words that we're now sort of familiar with over the last few weeks. We've talked about gain. Remember, that's the yitron. That's not just the short-term gain, but it's the lasting gain. What do we get from this in the long run? We have toil, which is the word amal, and it's not just, okay, I'm just going to work, but it's sort of the drudgery of work, the hardness of work. And then business, the inyan, it's the grievous sort of weight that we have going through life. And so we have these things. What is the gain that the worker has from the toil? And it's a rhetorical question, and the implied response is that we don't gain. We don't gain. Now pause, because as you say, oh, Mariah, you're so, just hold on. So that we don't have a lasting gain. With all our various activities, it's not us who's choosing these things, it's that God is sort of placing these things in our life, and as we navigate these situations, we're not the ones who's bringing about accomplishment. Instead, as we see at the start of verse 11, it's God's work. God is the one who fits the pieces together. He makes everything beautiful in its time. He makes everything wonderfully appropriate in its time. And so I'm going to take a real brief, just a second to talk about God's will. So God's will, we have three sort of areas, right? God's moral will, and we talked about this on Tuesday, so if you're here Tuesday, you get a little bit of recap. God's moral will. God's moral will is revealed in what? Please. Yeah, God's word. So God's word, the Bible, reveals God's moral will. There we go. We have God's absolute will. These are things that absolutely will happen. So Christ is going to come back, save us all from the craziness of the world. It was in God's absolute will that Jesus was going to come and die for the sins of mankind. Now, we also have God's permissive will. These are things that he allows to happen, that he allows to come into our lives. Now, what we have trouble with is figuring out which will applies when. We struggle day by day to recognize what's God up to. What are things that he's saying, okay, no, I have put this into your lives. This is a period of time that I am placing into your life versus, I think I can get out of this one. Like this is a situation that I can sort of navigate my way out of. And that is a struggle. That's a struggle for us to be able to determine what is God's real will in this? Does he mean for me to be in this period? Or is this something that I can escape? And so this leads us right into the second half of verse 11. Also, he has put eternity into man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from beginning to end. And this is one of the things that divides people from everything else in creation, is that we have this conception of time. Both something can happen tomorrow, but also eternity. Eternity is something that we can kind of fathom. But also, we can't. Like, I can't fathom eternity. You can't fathom eternity. When we try to think about it, our brains break. And when we try to think about how does everything fit into God's plan of eternity, we can't figure it out. We only have a very small snapshot, even with what's revealed in Scripture. We have a very small picture of what exactly God's up to. And that's going to be developed in verse 14. This is humbling. There we go. To be continued. All right, verse 14. No, 12 and 13. Go! There we go. I perceive that there is nothing better for them than to be joyful and to do good as long as they live. Also that everyone should eat and drink and take pleasure in all his toil. This is God's gift to man. Now, this is our Enjoy Life refrain number 2. We saw that this, in response to the fact that God is the one who is making things happen and that we don't really know exactly what's going on, Kohelet again counsels joy. Now, this is developed from the first Enjoy Life refrain. We see the additional elements of doing good. He says to actually do good. Don't just enjoy things. Do the things that are good in life. He says to take pleasure in our toil. And the Hebrew is actually to see what is good. To see what is good in our toil. To recognize that these are the good things that God has allowed in our lives. And he says that it's a gift. We said that it was a gift last week, but that was just sort of reading forward to this week. I'm like, yes, this is a gift that God has given to us, that he is the one who's saying, okay, yes, I'm appointing these things to you as a gift. Verse 14, I perceive that whatever God does endures forever. Nothing can be added to it, nor anything taken from it. God has done it so that people fear before him. Now, verse 14 parallels 1:15. What is crooked cannot be made straight. What is lacking cannot be counted. And in contrast to verse 10, which questions whether or not mankind can actually accomplish anything with his labor, Kohelet is emphasizing that God's accomplishments last forever. So what God does, God's the one who keeps the world spinning, right? It's not what I'm doing that's making any. It's God's the one who makes what we do matter. He is the one who does things which can't be challenged. And so, as a response, we see this additional development here of fear. That not just we're saying, oh, it's so nice that God's the one who's in charge. There's this element of reverential awe, of a little bit of terror. You're like, oh my goodness, God is so big. He is over all, and I'm just like this little tiny little cog, insignificant, and yet, as what's encouraging is that God does choose to use us. God has it in hand. And again, I think of James 4, 13 through 16, which talks about, hey, so tomorrow we're going to go into such and such a town. We're going to make these plans, make a profit. Yet, you don't know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? You're a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. And that's the appropriate response in fear to the recognition of what God is up to. Verse 15. That which is already has been. That which is to be already has been. And God seeks what is driven away. I'd like to highlight the parallel to chapter 1, verse 9. What has been is what will be. And what has been done is what will be done. And there's nothing new under the sun. And what's interesting about this parallel is the phrase, God seeks what has been driven away, is actually, if you can better translated, what has been passed by or what has been chased. And if you think about what has been chased, what are we talking about? We're talking about that striving after wind. And so as we consider our lives, what are we seeking? We seek lasting impact. But only God can do that. God's the one who seeks what has been driven away. God's the one who accomplishes great things. And we're just cogs in the wheel, right? And so as we look at sort of the structure of this section, we see, okay, so there's a time for everything. We are going to tie this back in next week, but obviously we already ran out of time, so I planned it. We're going to finish it out next week. So can humans gain? And we see that there's this God's eternal perspective centering on this enjoy life. Kohelet is counseling joy. But God, again, pulls in the eternal perspective so that we fear before him, and God accomplishes what we cannot. And so the conclusions from this section, that first of all, lean into whatever season that God has given to us. We can choose to cooperate with God, or we can, as the scripture says, kick against the goads. Don't kick against the goads, screaming all the way. Lean into what God is doing. It's not just seizing the moment, but seeing what God is up to, seeing God's movement in our lives. We may be small, but we are part of a big God's big plan. And so that's both something to keep, again, that fear, but it's not, oh my gosh, God is terrifying, I'm not going to do anything. It's, okay, fear, so I'm going to lean into what is God up to. And then, of course, to enjoy God's good gifts and to do good. I'm going to close out by reading Psalm 90, verses 12 and 17. So teach us to number our days, that we may gain a heart of wisdom. Let the favor of the Lord our God be upon us, and establish the work of our hands. Yes, establish the work of our hands. That's all. Thanks for staying long. Go in peace.
Thank you.
Deuce.
Run like you stole it.
What? Run like you stole it. Don't actually steal anything, but run like you stole it.